I teach third grade, so I know exactly what a child's face looks like the second she realizes she's been left out. I just never thought I'd see it on my own daughter, at my in-laws' Christmas tree. Every other kid in that room had a gift that night. The cousins, the second cousins, even the neighbor's 2 children, who my mother-in-law had met maybe twice. My little girl, Lena, sat with empty hands and didn't make a single sound. My mother-in-law believed family was blood, and she had spent years quietly drawing a line around my daughter. That night, my husband stood up with an envelope in his hand and said one quiet sentence that turned the whole room to stone. And what happened next? Nobody at that party ever forgot. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where the quiet ones who protect the people they love finally get the last word. If you've ever watched a child you adore be left out and felt your whole heart go cold, this one is for you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe so the next story finds you. My name is Myra Hayes, I'm 34, and I teach third grade in a small town in Minnesota. I met my husband, Grant, 5 years ago, when my daughter, Lena, was 4 years old. Lena's biological father had left before she could walk, signed away his rights without a fight, and disappeared into a life that had no room in it for her. For 2 years it had been just me and Lena, and I'd made my peace with the idea that it might always be. Then Grant came along, a broad, gentle man who fixes furnaces for a living and has the patience of someone who has spent his life with his hands inside complicated things. He didn't fall for me first. He fell for both of us at once. On our third date, he spent the whole evening building a blanket fort with Lena while I watched from the kitchen. And I knew, the way you know a true thing, that this was a man who understood that loving me meant loving her. No asterisk. We married a year later. He never once called Lena his stepdaughter. He called her his daughter, in private, in public, without thinking about it, because to him she simply was. I thought love like that would be enough to carry us through anything. I just didn't understand yet how hard some people will work to remind a child that she doesn't belong. Grant's family is the kind that talks about itself like a small kingdom, the Hayeses. There is a framed family tree hanging in my mother-in-law's living room, an actual chart with branches and dates, and Gail Hayes treats it the way some people treat scripture. She can tell you which Hayes settled which county, which Hayes served in which war, who married in, and who was, as she puts it, born to it. I found it charming at first. Family pride seemed like a warm thing. It took me a while to understand that for Gail, the chart wasn't about who you loved. It was about who counted. And by Gail's arithmetic, my daughter did not. It was never loud. That's the thing about this kind of cruelty, the kind aimed at a child by a grandmother. It hides inside good manners. It was a hug for the other grandchildren and a stiff little pat on the shoulder for Lena. It was 3 presents under the tree with the cousins' names and nothing with hers. It was the way Gail's voice warmed for the others and cooled, just slightly, just enough, when she turned to my girl. One Christmas 2 years back, when Lena was small enough to still ask questions out loud, she'd tugged a wrapped box that turned out to be for a cousin, and Gail had taken it gently from her hands and said, with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes, "Those are for my real grandchildren, sweetheart." My real grandchildren. I heard it. Grant heard it. And a 7-year-old heard it too, and filed it away in the place where children keep the things that teach them what they're worth. For a long time, I told myself Lena was too young to notice. That is a lie parents tell themselves so they don't have to act. Children notice everything. They are tiny scientists of belonging, constantly measuring who gets the warm voice and who gets the cool one, and Lena had been running the experiment on Gail for years. The proof came on a Tuesday after school, the spring she turned 9. She was quiet in the car, which wasn't like her. And when I asked what was wrong, she looked out the window and said, in the small flat voice kids use for the questions that scare them, "Mom, why doesn't Grandma Gail like me?" I nearly drove off the road. I asked her what she meant, buying time, and she listed it for me, calm and devastating, the way only a child can. Brooke's kids got bigger Easter baskets. Grandma hugged the cousins longer. Grandma had a special name for everybody but her. I think I did something, Lena said. I just can't remember what. I had to pull into a gas station and pretend I needed gas so she wouldn't see my face, because here was my bright, kind, blameless little girl sitting in the back seat doing the math, and the only answer the math gave her was that she herself was the problem. That she had failed some test she didn't know she was taking. There is no rage like the rage of watching your child absorb someone else's poison and mistake it for her own reflection. I went home that night, and I did not yell, and I did not cry where she could hear me. I waited until she was asleep, and then I told Grant we needed to talk. I have never seen Grant truly angry, not in 5 years, not the loud kind. He goes the other way. He gets very still and very quiet, and that night, sitting at our kitchen table while I told him what Lena had said in the car, he got stiller than I'd ever seen him. When I finished, he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he put his big careful hands flat on the table and said, in a voice like cold iron, "She's my daughter. I don't care whose blood she's got. She's mine, and I'm done letting my mother make her feel like a guest in this family." I told him I'd tried, over the years, the soft ways. I'd dropped hints to Gail, pushed back gently, tried to give her the chance to be better. I'd swallowed 100 small things to keep the peace, because that's what I do. That's the muscle I've built my whole life, the one that absorbs and tells itself it's keeping everyone safe. And Grant looked at me with so much love and so much frustration, and said the thing I needed to hear. "Keeping the peace isn't the same as protecting her," he said. "Sometimes the peace is the problem." He was right. I had been so busy not making waves that I'd let my daughter float alone in cold water for years. That stopped that night. We didn't yet know exactly what we'd do, only that we were done managing Gail's feelings at the expense of Lena's. We were going to do something real, something that couldn't be undone with a hug or a missing present, something that would answer Gail's family tree with a truth she couldn't argue with. It was Grant who said it first, a few nights later, lying in the dark where the hard, true things get said. "I want to adopt her," he said. "Legally. I want to be her father on paper, the way I already am everywhere else." I lay there in the quiet and felt my eyes fill. We'd talked about it loosely before, the way you talk about someday, but this was different. This had a spine to it. He went on, and what struck me most was his reason, because it wasn't about Gail at all. "I don't want to do it to prove a point to my mother," he said. "I want to do it because Lena deserves to know that one of her parents chose her, on purpose, with paperwork and a judge, and everything. She didn't get to choose where she came from, but she should get to know, for the rest of her life, that she was chosen." I turned over and looked at him in the dark, and I thought, not for the first time, that I had somehow found the one. Lena's biological father had signed his rights away years ago, no contest, no interest, which I'd once experienced as a wound and now understood as a strange mercy, because it meant the path was clear. There was no battle to fight, only a process to follow. We decided, right there, to start it quietly. We would not tell Gail. We would not tell anyone. This was not going to be a weapon we announced or a threat we held over the family. It was going to be a gift, the realest one Lena would ever get, and we were going to wrap it carefully and give it to her at exactly the right moment. The lawyer we found was a kind, brisk woman who handled step-parent adoptions all the time, and she told us, after reviewing everything, that ours was about as simple as these things get. Because Lena's biological father had already terminated his rights, there was no one to fight, no consent to chase down, no parent to track or notify. It would be, in her words, uncontested and clean. File the petition, submit the paperwork, a background check, a home study formality, and then a hearing in front of a judge who would, in all likelihood, simply sign the order and say congratulations. She said it could be done in a matter of a few months. We started immediately, and we told no one, not my parents, not Grant's, not Lena herself, because we wanted to be sure before we let her hope. I want to stop here for a second because I know some of you watching have loved a child who wasn't born to you. A stepchild, a grandchild, a niece, a foster child, a kid down the street who needed a soft place. And I know some of you have watched that child be treated as lesser by people who should have known better. If that's you, I see you, and I want you to know that the love you give a child is never lesser, no matter what some family tree on a wall says. So do me a favor right now, drop a comment with the name of a child you chose to love, blood or not. Let's fill the comments with kids who got picked on purpose. I read everyone. Back at our kitchen table, the petition went in the mail, and a quiet clock started ticking toward a courtroom none of the Hayeses knew existed. While the paperwork moved through its quiet channels, the holidays came at us the way they always do, fast and loud and full of obligation. Gail called in early November to announce, in the tone of a woman planning a coronation, that this year's Christmas party was going to be the big one. The whole family. Both sides of hers. The Hayes cousins from 3 counties. She was going all out, she said, and she wanted everyone there. And then she added the line that put a cold finger on the back of my neck. "I've got something special for all the grandchildren this year," she said. "Every last one of them. Every last one of them." I held the phone, and I felt the old, careful part of me start doing what it always does, translating Gail, parsing her for the trapdoor. Did all the grandchildren include Lena, or was Lena, as always, the silent exception inside the word all? With Gail, you could never be sure, and that uncertainty was itself the cruelty, the way she kept my daughter perpetually auditioning for a role the other kids were simply born into. I almost said something. I almost asked her, point blank, whether my daughter was included in her every last one. But I didn't, because I already knew that asking would just give Gail the pleasure of an answer she could shape however she liked. Instead, I said we'd be there, and I hung up. And I stood in my kitchen with a bad feeling settling into my bones. Some part of me already knew how that party was going to go. And some part of me, the part that had stopped keeping the peace, was almost glad. Because we had an envelope on the way. And Gail had no idea she was setting her own stage. The confirmation that nothing had changed came a couple of weeks later, at a smaller family dinner, and it came from Brooke. Brooke is Grant's younger sister, Gail's daughter, and she has spent her whole life as a fully vested member of the kingdom, which has made her comfortable in a way that curdles into casual cruelty. Her 2 kids are the golden ones, the ones Gail's voice warms for the most. That night, the children were in the next room playing, and someone mentioned how well Lena and Brooke's daughter got along, how sweet it was, cousins close in age. And Brooke, swirling her wine, smiled and said lightly, like she was commenting on the weather, "They are sweet together. Though Lena's not really a Hayes, is she? Not really a cousin? But it's nice she has someone to play with. Not really a Hayes, not really a cousin," said about 2 little girls who had their arms around each other on the living room floor. I felt Grant go rigid beside me. I put my hand on his knee under the table because this was not the moment, not the place, not the way. I made myself smile and I said something neutral and I changed the subject, and inside I took that sentence and I set it down next to all the others, in the growing pile of evidence I was building without quite admitting that's what I was doing. Brooke had no idea what she'd just confirmed. She thought she was making small talk. She was actually telling me that the rot wasn't just Gail, it was the whole orchard. And it told me, with total clarity, that the soft approach was finished. You cannot hint your way out of a family that has decided a child doesn't count. The hardest part, the part that still catches in my throat, is that Lena loved them anyway. That's the thing about children. Their love doesn't keep score the way ours learns to. Even after the cool hugs and the missing presents and the special names she never got, Lena still lit up when we said we were going to Grandma Gail's. She practiced for that Christmas party like it was Broadway. She and a cousin had a little song and dance number they'd been rehearsing, and Lena worked on it every night in the living room, narrating her own choreography, making me be the audience over and over. "Grandma's gonna love it," she told me, breathless, spinning. "Everybody's gonna be there." She wanted so badly to perform for them. to be seen by them, to earn, through effort and sweetness, the belonging that should have just been hers. And I'd sit on the couch and clap and tell her she was wonderful, which she was, and my heart would break a little more each time, because I knew what I suspected was coming, and I knew that no amount of perfect spinning would change a single thing in Gail's cold arithmetic. That's what these people never understand. The cruelty doesn't land on the adults who can take it. It lands on a 9-year-old practicing a dance for a grandmother who has already decided not to clap. I watched my daughter prepare to give her whole open heart to a room that had a line drawn around her, and I made a quiet promise on that couch. This was the last Christmas she would ever spend trying to earn her place at a Hayes table. One way or another, after this, she would never have to audition again. A few days before the party, Gail called and asked if I'd come over to help wrap gifts and set up. She framed it as a kindness, an invitation. But with Gail there was always an undertow, a small power in being the one who summons. I went. Partly because saying no would have cost more peace than I wanted to spend, and partly, if I'm honest, because some watchful part of me wanted to see the operation up close. Her dining room was a Christmas factory. Rolls of paper, ribbon, tags, stacks of boxes sorted into careful piles. We worked for an hour, folding and taping, Gail chattering about the menu and the cousins and how nice it was that I could help. At one point, she sent me to the craft room off the hallway to find another roll of the silver paper. "The good kind," she said in the cabinet by the window. I went looking. The craft room was Gail's domain, a tidy little space with labeled bins and a sewing table, and I opened the cabinet she'd described and started moving things to find the silver roll. And that's when I saw the box. It wasn't hidden, exactly. It was just there, on a shelf, a shoebox with the lid half off, and inside it was a stack of pale envelopes, and on top, in Gail's neat handwriting, a folded sheet of lined paper. I shouldn't have looked. I know that. But the word at the top of that paper caught my eye before I could stop myself, written in Gail's careful cursive and underlined twice, "Grandchildren." I stood very still in that quiet craft room, the silver paper forgotten in my hand, and I picked up the list. The envelopes were savings bonds. I'd opened the top one before I'd decided to, and there it was, a government savings bond made out in a child's name, the kind of gift grandparents buy to say, "I am investing in your future. I am betting on you. You are mine to plan for." I looked at the name. It was one of Brooke's kids. I set it down and looked at the list, and the list explained everything. It was an inventory. Down the left side, in Gail's tidy hand, were the names of her grandchildren, every single one, and beside each name a dollar amount and a little check mark. Brooke's too. The cousins. A grandchild I'd met exactly once. Names of children who lived 3 counties away and saw Gail twice a year. Each one accounted for. Each one invested in. Each one, in Gail's careful cursive, claimed. I read the list twice, top to bottom, my heart pounding in that small, quiet room. And the thing that finally broke something open in my chest was not what was on the list. It was what wasn't. There was no Lena. Not at the bottom. Not crossed out. Not pending. My daughter's name simply did not appear anywhere on a document titled Grandchildren, a document that included children Gail barely knew. This was not forgetfulness. You do not forget to include a child who comes to your house, who practices a dance for your party, who calls you grandma. You leave her off. On purpose. With a pen. I stood there holding the proof of a thing I'd spent years telling myself I might be imagining, and in that moment, every soft excuse I'd ever made for Gail Hayes quietly died. I did not confront her. I want you to understand the discipline that took. Because every cell in my body wanted to walk back into that dining room and put the list on the table between the ribbon and the tape and ask her to read me the names out loud. But I am a 3rd-grade teacher. I have spent 15 years learning that the loudest reaction is almost never the one that actually protects a child. A scene in that craft room would have given Gail exactly what she needed. the chance to call me hysterical, to make herself the victim of my temper, to reframe a documented pattern of exclusion as one daughter-in-law's unstable outburst. No. I put the list back exactly as I'd found it. I found the silver paper. I walked back into the dining room and I wrapped presents beside the woman who kept a ledger of which children deserved a future, and I made my voice normal, and I have never been prouder of my own steadiness in my life. Because I understood, finally and completely, what I was dealing with. This was not coldness. Coldness is passive. This was a system. A deliberate, documented, ongoing decision to draw a circle and keep my daughter outside it. Maintained year after year with the same care Gail gave to her family tree. And a system can only be answered by something equally real. Not a fight. Not a speech. A fact. Signed by a judge that no list in a shoebox could ever outrank. I drove home that afternoon with the shape of it finally clear in my mind. The adoption wasn't just a gift for Lena anymore. It was the one true answer to a question Gail had been asking my daughter her whole life, and I could not wait to deliver it. That night, after Lena was asleep, I did something I'd quietly arranged before I left Gail's house. When she'd stepped away to take a phone call, I had asked her, casually, whether I could photocopy her grandchildren gift list so I could help her match the bond envelopes to the right Christmas cards, a small helpful lie that a woman who lives for organization could not resist saying yes to. She'd waved her hand and told me to use the machine in the office. So I had a copy. And now I unfolded it and laid it flat on our own kitchen table, under the light, in front of Grant. He read it the way he reads a wiring diagram, slow and careful, his finger moving down the names. I watched him reach the bottom. I watched him go back to the top and read it again, because his mind, like mine, refused to accept the absence the first time. Then he looked up at me, and his jaw was tight, and his eyes were wet, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. I said it for both of us, the sentence I'd been carrying since the craft room. Every name but hers, I said. She didn't forget my daughter. She kept a list, and she left her off it on purpose. Grant put the paper down very gently like it might cut him. Then he said, in that cold iron voice, "When does the lawyer think the judge signs?" I told him soon, weeks, maybe less. And right there, over a photocopied list of every grandchild Gail Hayes had ever claimed, we made our decision, the two of us, quiet and final. We would push to finish the adoption before Christmas. We would say nothing. We would walk into that party like always. And if Gail did at that tree what her own handwriting promised she would do, we would answer her, once, in front of everyone, with the only document that mattered. And then we would take our daughter and go. The call came 8 days before Christmas. I was in my classroom, the kids at recess, grading spelling tests, when my phone buzzed with the lawyer's name and I answered it with my heart already in my throat. She was warm and quick, and she said the words I will remember for the rest of my life. "The judge signed this morning," she said. "It's done. Congratulations. Grant is legally Lena's father. The new birth certificate is being processed, and you'll have certified copies of the decree within the week." I sat down in a tiny third-grade chair because my legs didn't feel like mine. It was done. Somewhere in a courthouse, a judge had reviewed our boring, beautiful, uncontested paperwork and put his signature on a piece of paper that said, with the full weight of the law, that my daughter belonged, fully and permanently, to a man who had chosen her. Not by blood, by decision. I called Grant from the parking lot, and I heard his voice break clean in half when I told him, this enormous, gentle man crying in a customer's basement next to a furnace. We agreed in that call not to tell Lena yet. We wanted to give it to her as a gift, wrapped, at the right moment. And we both knew, without saying it, exactly when that moment would be. Gail's party was 4 days away. The certified copies would arrive before then. We would put the decree in an envelope, and we would bring it to the very tree where, for years, my daughter had sat empty-handed while a woman handed out belonging like it was hers alone to Grant. Gail thought Christmas was her stage. She had no idea she'd already lost the only argument that mattered weeks ago in a courtroom she'd never heard of. All that was left was the unwrapping. The decree arrived 2 days before Christmas, certified copies in a flat envelope, the judge's signature crisp and real. Grant and I sat at the kitchen table after Lena was in bed and we built the gift. This was the part we let ourselves enjoy. We weren't planning a humiliation. We were planning a coronation of our own, the kind that doesn't need anyone to be small for someone else to be lifted up. Into a plain envelope we put one of the certified copies of the adoption decree and a single sheet where Grant had written, in his careful block letters, words simple enough for a 9-year-old to understand. And then we added the second thing, the thing that turned a legal document into a child's dream come true. Lena had been obsessed for over a year with the Northern Lights. She had a book about Iceland she'd checked out from the school library so many times the librarian finally just gave it to her. So Grant had booked it, a trip. The 3 of us, in February, to stand under the aurora in the cold, clear dark. We printed the confirmation and slid it into the envelope behind the decree. 1 envelope, 2 gifts, the legal truth that she was chosen, and the adventure that proved being chosen was the start of a whole life of wonder. We sealed it. We wrote her name on the front, just Lena, in Grant's hand. And we made a quiet plan for the party. The 2 of us. Nothing dramatic. Just a readiness. If Gail did right by our girl, the envelope could wait for Christmas morning at home. But if she did at that tree what her list promised she'd do, then Grant would stand up, and our daughter would open this one last. The Hayes Christmas party was, I'll admit, beautiful. Gail does not do anything halfway. The big house glowed from the road, every window warm, a tree in the front room that nearly touched the ceiling, draped in 40 years of ornaments with stories attached to each one. The family poured in, Brooke and her husband and their golden children, Aunt Lorraine, Gail's sister, with a car full of presents, cousins from 3 counties. Even, as promised, the neighbors from down the road with their 2 small kids, people Gail could barely have known, folded into the warmth as if belonging were the easiest thing in the world to hand out. Lena wore the green velvet dress she'd picked herself, and she had a candy cane in one hand and stars in her eyes, and she found her cousin and immediately started whispering about their dance number. She was so happy. She was so completely, trustingly happy to be there. And watching her, I felt the old fear coil tight in my stomach. I knew what was in my husband's coat pocket. I knew what was probably about to happen by that tree. And I want to be honest with you, because that's the only way these stories mean anything. Part of me, even then, hoped I was wrong. Hoped that this year, with the whole family watching, Gail would simply hand my daughter a gift and let her be a child at Christmas, and that the envelope could stay folded in Grant's pocket. A secret joy for another morning. I am a mother. I would have traded my whole satisfying ending for one ordinary moment of Gail just being kind to my kid. Tell me in the comments if you know that exact feeling, hoping against everything that someone will finally surprise you by doing the decent thing. I held my breath, and the party rolled on toward the tree. After dinner came the part the children had been vibrating for all evening, the gifts under the tree. Gail loves this ritual more than any other because it puts her at the center of it. The giver, the source, the warm sun, all the little planets orbit. She settled into her armchair by the tree like a queen on a throne and began. She did it the way she always does, by hand, one at a time, calling each child up by name. Caleb, she sang out, and Brooke's son came running and she made a little fuss over him as he tore into a big bright box. Sophie, Brooke's daughter, another fuss, another squeal. The cousins from 3 counties, one by one, each name called with warmth. Each child hugged and handed something wonderful. Then, and I watched this happen with my own eyes, she called up the neighbor children, the 2 little ones she'd met maybe twice. And we didn't forget our special guests. Gail beamed, producing 2 wrapped gifts, and the neighbor kids lit up, and their parents made grateful noises, and the whole room glowed with the warmth of a generous woman on Christmas. I sat very still on the couch with Grant's hand in mine, his grip getting tighter with every name that wasn't hers, because the pile under the tree was shrinking, and I was watching my daughter, who had crept closer and closer to the front during the calling of names, who was standing now near the edge of the circle of children, her candy cane forgotten in her hand, her face turned up toward her grandmother with a hope so naked it hurt to look at. She was waiting for her name. She had been waiting for her name her whole life, and the presents under that tree were almost gone. Gail reached under the tree, pulled out the last gift, and called a cousin's name. The cousin came and took it. And then Gail brushed her hands together, the small, satisfied gesture of a job well done, and looked around the circle of beaming children with the warmth of a woman who had given everyone their due. The space under the tree was empty. There was nothing left. And Lena was still standing there. My daughter stood at the edge of the circle in her green velvet dress, her hands open at her sides, and I watched the understanding move across her face in real time, the exact expression I have seen 100 times on 100 children at school, and prayed I would never see on her. The slow dawning, the recalculation, the hope folding itself quietly away. She looked at the empty space under the tree, and she looked at the other children clutching their presents, and she looked at her grandmother, who had already turned to say something to Aunt Lorraine, who had moved on, who was done. And Lena did not cry. That's the part that broke me. She did not throw a fit or run to me or ask why. She just lowered her open hands, and she made herself very small and very still, and she sat down on the floor at the edge of the group with her face carefully arranged into the blank, brave nothing that children learn when they've decided not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing it land. 9 years old, and she already knew how to absorb it silently. She had learned that here, in this room. And around her, slowly, the adults began to notice the silence too. A few smiles faltered. Someone shifted. The warmth in the room developed a small cold crack down its center. It was Aunt Lorraine, of all people, who said it out loud. She glanced at Lena sitting alone and empty-handed on the floor and said, in the bright, oblivious voice of someone filling a silence, "Oh, Gail, did little Lena not get one? Looks like you missed one, hun." The room went quiet in that particular way, the way a room goes quiet when everyone suddenly realizes they're about to find out something about the people they're with. Every adult eye moved to Gail, and my mother-in-law, sitting in her throne by the tree with the firelight on her face, had a choice in that moment. She could have covered it. She could have said, "Oh my goodness, how silly of me," and produced something, anything, and saved my daughter and saved herself. Instead, Gail Hayes looked at her sister, and she glanced at my daughter sitting on the floor, and she said, with a small dismissive smile and a voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "Those are for my real grandchildren, Lorraine. Those are for my real grandchildren." The same words from 2 years ago, said again, in front of the whole family, over the bowed head of a 9-year-old girl in a green velvet dress. The crack down the center of the room's warmth split wide open. I heard Brooke's husband mutter something. I saw a cousin's mouth fall open. I felt Grant, beside me, go absolutely still, that cold iron stillness, and I knew the waiting was over. I looked at my daughter, sitting small on the floor, having just heard her grandmother announce to the entire family that she was not real, and something in me that had been keeping the peace for 5 long years simply set down its burden and stood up. But Grant stood up first. I need to tell you what it costs not to scream. Every instinct I have as a mother was a wildfire in that moment. I wanted to cross that room and tell Gail Hayes exactly what she was, in front of God and the cousins and the neighbors she'd been so generous to. I wanted to grab my daughter and carry her out into the snow and never look back, but I have learned, in 15 years of classrooms and 5 years of this family, that the fire is not what protects a child. The fire makes you the story. It lets them say, "Did you see how she lost it?" And suddenly the conversation is about my temper instead of Gail's cruelty. So I did the hardest thing. I stayed calm. I put my hand on Lena's shoulder, grounding her, telling her without words that I was right there, and I let the room hold its terrible silence for one beat longer. And in that silence, I saw something I'll never forget. I saw Roy, my father-in-law, Gail's quiet husband of 40 years, start to rise from his chair at the back, his face stricken, his mouth opening as if he might finally, after all these years, say something. He half stood, and then his old habit caught him, and he glanced at Gail, and he sank back down, the words dying in his throat. It was the saddest thing in the room, sadder almost than Gail's cruelty, that decades of deference could freeze a decent man at the exact moment his granddaughter needed him to be brave. But it didn't matter, in the end, that Roy couldn't stand. Because my husband could. Grant let go of my hand. He rose to his full height in the center of that warm, cracked watching room. And he reached into his coat. Grant did not raise his voice. That's what made the whole room turn. A shout they could have dismissed. But a big, gentle man standing up slowly in total silence that pulls every eye in a room like gravity. He took the plain white envelope out of his coat, and he held it up for a moment so the firelight caught it, and then he walked across the room, past the tree, past his mother in her throne, and he knelt down on the floor in front of Lena, so that his eyes were level with hers. The whole family watched. Gail watched, her satisfied little smile beginning, for the first time all night, to look uncertain. Grant held out the envelope to our daughter, and in a voice that was quiet and steady and meant only for her even though everyone could hear it, he said the words. "Lena," he said, "you open this one last." She looked at him, this child who had just been told in front of everyone that she wasn't real, and she took the envelope in her small hands. Her fingers were trembling. The room was so silent I could hear the fire pop. Lena looked at her name written on the front in Grant's careful hand, and then she looked up at him, uncertain, checking, the way children do when they've learned that good things might be taken back. Grant just nodded at her, gentle as anything. "Go on, sweetheart," he said. "This one's really yours." And I watched my daughter, kneeling on the floor of a room that had spent her whole childhood telling her she didn't belong, slide her finger under the flap of that envelope while every single member of the Hayes family held their breath. Gail had given out a dozen gifts that night, to real grandchildren and near strangers alike. But not one of them was about to be opened the way this one was. Not one of them was going to change anything. This one was going to change everything. Lena pulled out the papers. The first one was Grant's note, his block letters, and she read it silently, her lips moving, and I watched her small face try to understand. So Grant helped her. He put his finger on the official document behind the note, the one with the judge's signature and the heavy official heading, and he explained it to her the way you explain the biggest thing in the world to a 9-year-old. "That paper," he said softly, "is from a judge. It's the law now, Lena. It says that I'm your dad, not a pretend dad, not a stepdad. Your real, legal, forever dad, written down and signed and true. I adopted you. You're my daughter, officially, and nobody, ever, can change that or take it back." For a second she didn't move, and then it hit her, the whole size of it, and my brave girl who had not cried when she was left empty-handed burst into tears and threw her arms around Grant's neck, and he caught her and stood up with her, lifting her right off the floor, holding my daughter, our daughter, in the middle of that silent room. And then Lena, with her face buried in his shoulder, said the word she'd never quite said before. She said, "Dad," out loud, in front of everyone. The room made a sound, a collective intake of breath. Somebody's quiet sob, Aunt Lorraine's hand flying to her mouth, and I stood up. I didn't shout. I didn't even walk toward Gail. I just stood beside my husband and my crying, beaming daughter, and I said, in a voice pitched calm and clear for the whole room to hear, the only sentence I had prepared. "She's a Hayes now," I said. "By law. By choice. And by every single Christmas you spent pretending she wasn't." Then the room turned, slowly, all of it, away from the child by the tree and toward the woman in the throne. And Gail Hayes, for the first time in the 40 years of her kingdom, had nothing to hand anyone. Gail came up out of her chair. The composure she'd worn all night, the warm hostess glow, cracked apart, and what came out from under it was pure heat. She was not ashamed. That's the thing I want you to understand about people like Gail. Even caught, even exposed, even with a sobbing newly adopted child in the center of the room, her first emotion was not shame. It was fury at being caught. "How dare you?" she said, her voice rising, shaking. "How dare you turn my Christmas into a performance? You planned this. You set me up, in my own home, to humiliate me in front of the whole family." She looked around the room for her usual chorus, the nods, the agreement, the soft landing she'd always been given. She didn't find it. The faces around her were not on her side, so she doubled down, because it was all she had. "I have nothing to apologize for," she said. "I love my family. My real family. I never asked for someone else's child to be treated like." And that's where Grant cut her off. Not loudly. Just one word. Her name. Mom. Like a door closing, and she actually stopped. I stepped forward then. Just one step, and I kept my voice level, because I had learned from her, finally, that the calm voice is the one that wins. "You kept a list, Gail," I said. "I saw it. Every grandchild's name with a bond and a checkmark. You bought a future for children you've met twice. And you sat my 9-year-old daughter on your floor and told a roomful of people she wasn't real." The silence was total. Gail's eyes flicked, just once, toward the hallway, toward the craft room, toward the shoebox. And in that tiny, involuntary glance, the whole family saw the truth confirmed. "You humiliated yourself," I said, gently now, almost kindly. "Every year. One missing gift at a time. We just stopped helping you hide it." And Gail, who had always had something to say, opened her mouth, and found, for once, that there was nothing in it. For a moment nobody moved. Then, from the back of the room, Roy stood up. This time he didn't look at Gail first. He crossed the room slowly, an old man in a Christmas sweater, and he knelt down in front of Lena the way Grant had, his knees cracking, and he reached into his own pocket. He took out his pocket watch, the heavy old one I'd seen him check 100 times, the one his own father had given him, a real Hayes heirloom if there ever was one. And he pressed it into Lena's small hands and closed her fingers around it and said, his voice rough and breaking, "This was my dad's. I want you to have it, sweetheart. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry it took me this long." Lena looked at the watch and at her grandfather, and she said, "Thank you, Grandpa." And the simple grace of it, the way she still had a grandpa in her heart to give, undid half the room. Gail watched her husband of 40 years choose the child she'd crossed off her list, and something in her face finally flickered. Not quite shame, even then, but the first crack in the certainty that had ruled her whole life. We didn't stay to watch it finish breaking. That wasn't the point. The point was never to destroy Gail. The point was Lena. So Grant set our daughter down, and I took her hand, and we got our coats. We said Merry Christmas to the cousins, and to Roy, and to Aunt Lorraine, who was crying openly now. And we walked out of that warm, bright house into the falling snow, the three of us, our daughter between us with a pocket watch in one hand and an envelope in the other, and we did not slam the door, and we did not look back. We just left, heads up, together. A family, walking out into the clean, cold dark. In the parking lot, with the snow coming down soft and the house glowing behind us, Lena stopped and looked up at me, and she asked the question I'd been dreading and waiting for. "Mom," she said, "do we have to come back here?" I knelt down in the snow so we were eye to eye, the way Grant and Roy had, because some things you have to say at a child's level. "Here's how it's going to be," I told her. "We will always, always have room for people who love you the real way. Grandpa Roy, if he keeps being brave like he was tonight. Anyone who's kind to you. Our door stays open for love, But you are never again going to sit at a table where you have to earn your place at it. Not ever. You don't audition for family. You just are it. And you are ours." She thought about that, the way she thinks about everything seriously, and then she nodded and held up her envelope and said, "Can we really go to Iceland?" And just like that, she was 9 again, and we laughed in the snow, and it was over. The weeks after were quieter than you'd think. Gail sent a few texts, defensive at first, then silent, the ball sitting in her court where we left it. We didn't chase her. An apology you have to demand isn't worth the breath. But Roy came by, on his own, the week after Christmas, and he sat at our kitchen table and he cried a little, and he asked if he could take Lena to the Science Museum, just the two of them, and he has been showing up ever since. A grandfather building something real from scratch, without his wife's permission and without her list. And in February, the 3 of us flew to Iceland. We stood in a field in the freezing dark with our breath fogging the air, and the sky above us caught fire, green and violet, rivers of light pouring across the stars. Lena tilted her head all the way back and stared up at it with her whole face open, and she reached out and took Grant's gloved hand in hers, and without looking away from the sky, easy as breathing, she said, "Thanks, Dad." Not a performance, not for anyone, just true. Grant didn't say anything. He couldn't. He just held his daughter's hand under the northern lights, a man who had chosen a little girl on purpose, with a judge and a piece of paper and his whole entire heart. And I stood beside them in the cold, watching my family glow under that impossible sky, finally, completely, whole. Family was never about whose blood you carry. It's about who stands up in a crowded room and says, out loud, "This child is mine." If you made it all the way to the end, you already know that cold feeling, watching a child you love be left out, and deciding finally to stop pretending it's fine. The empty hands by the tree, the list with one name missing, the envelope, the walk into the snow. Maybe someone stood up for you once, the way Grant stood up for Lena. Maybe you've been the one who stood up. Tell me in the comments who claimed you, or who you claimed, blood or not. Share this with someone who needs to hear that love is a choice you make out loud. And subscribe to Calm Drama Stories, because the children who get chosen on purpose deserve a whole sky full of light. Your story might be next.